What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
The Hupa tribe is one of a few native tribes that wasn't completely forced off of their land in the U.S. by the U.S. government and settlers' genocide of native people. And we have to assume that the native resistance fighter Curly-Headed Tom is one reason why. Stephanie Lumsden is Hupa, and she teaches in Native American Studies at UC Davis. And she's here to talk about one of the lost histories of resistance. Our conversation centers on this one piece of history that the U.S. and U.S. empire would prefer to be disappeared because it rightly makes the U.S. and U.S. settlers out to be the villains. Stephanie, thank you for coming on the podcast. The area that we're speaking about, where Hupa people generally lived before the U.S. genocide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. The area we're speaking about, the Hupa original homelands, are up in the northwestern corner of the state of California and into what's now, the southern part of Oregon. So the end of the Willamette or the Pacific Northwest, the kind of Willamette Valley Trail and all the valleys that go down. So if you're in the Bay Area, I know that, and in Sacramento, we like to say that this is Northern California, but there's actually 6 hours further north. There's the real Northern California.
Sure. Yeah.
That's the general area. Places that have been claimed by the federal government in the forms of like federal and state parks and forests, and I think Six Rivers National Forest, that is actually the traditional homeland of the Hupa people.
Cool. Yeah, that helps contextualize for people who are trying to think of where on the map, since most people that are listening to this will be in the Bay Area. That gives you an idea. So I was really stoked to hear your paper that you gave at the most recent American Studies Association conference last year in Baltimore. The panel that you were on, it was about the topic of revenge, and wondering what drew you and the other panelists to this idea of revenge.
Yeah, it was really exciting to be invited to be on that panel and to come together and talk about anti-colonial resistance, I think was the frame we were looking at. But we were looking at each of us in different projects, looking in ways to talk about anti-colonial refusal of nonviolence and how that kind of coalesced or is inspired by, or like retribution is something that's earned, instead of that really liberal fetishization of nonviolence as the only way forward to a liberatory future. In my case, looking at Hupa resistance to U.S. invasion and occupation in our homelands after the gold rush, nonviolence, of course, is not really an option at all. So really brought us together in a really important way to resuscitate or recapture what a refusal of nonviolence means insofar as it relates to things that we might think of as softer, like care, and how, violent retribution in the case of many of the Hupa revolutionaries, resistors that I talk about, that the refusal of nonviolence was not something that they look forward to doing. It's like nobody, I think, skips gleefully into warfare except for maybe the genocidal psychopaths from the United States, but that act was an act of love, that it was in defense of the more than human beings and relations and lifeways that made life possible in the valley for everybody. So that was kind of the refrain we were all entering into. Revenge becomes one of those analytics or ways to trace, the motivations of historical actors. But also, I use the phrase settling up in my paper because that's a very California Indian way of talking. Like if somebody's insulted you, right? Somebody's spoke dirt on your name or whatever, they owe you something. They owe a price. So you would settle up for that. So for me, revenge, retribution can also be a form of settling up. Like something is owed here and I'm the one to take it. And so I kind of played with that term settling up in the paper and call it like settling up or settling the score with settlers. Like that revenge is perhaps more capacious than some people hold it. So I hope that's what the panel did.
Sure. Yeah. The definition of revenge, we could talk about that for a whole episode, but I am really excited about talking more about your specific paper that you spoke about. Part of it, you start by giving us a lay of the land a little bit, the conflict that the people who were coming from the East brought. Everything kind of coalesced around the 1860s, sorry, when there was a treaty. It was like a misnomer for this treaty of peace and friendship in 1864. What was promised to people at that point?
Yeah, in 1864, this is after about seven years of open hostility between the U.S. and the Hupa people and allies, including the other tribes in the area. The Yurok and the Karuk are also really important in these wars against the United States. There's the Red Cap War, which is really famous in our area. It doesn't get a lot of love, which is by historians, which I think is a shame because it's just about a few hundred California Indians fighting and holding off the U.S. Army for a number of years. It's pretty incredible. So after all these fights, and our elders tell the U.S. Army that if they keep sending men to the valley, they're sending them there to die, that we're not leaving, that that's our home forever, is a Hupa phrase about our homelands, that we won't be leaving. And that goes on for some time, much loss on the side of the California Indians, but also a lot of loss and a lot of debt. They really nearly bankrupt the U.S. Army at a fledgling time. And it's under these conditions that they meet for a treaty with the Hupa. So they meet with our captains, is what we call them, to sign this treaty of peace and friendship. And very much like the United States, they give themselves like lots of lofty names. It's actually very reminiscent of laws, isn't it? Like the Family Safety or Families Act. Anything that's
right.
Safety, harmony, good times is like a very insidious law. Like it's never.
Yeah, that should sketch you out from the beginning. Yeah.
Like they're promising protection, that word in particular, right? You're like, uh-oh. So that has always been true. This treaty of peace and friendship between the U.S. and the Hupa, South Fork, Redwood Creek, and Grouse Creek Indians. These are smaller groups that the Hupa later absorb after the war's end. But they're promised a number of things: rations, supplies to make up for the disruption of their food systems, right? The soldiers cut down oak trees to try and starve Indian resistance. So now the food and rations are things that would be owed. An Indian agent to remain on the reservation. Indian agents were like police or like wardens. They were really the first creeps on Indian reservations up in the north, because we didn't have missions that far north. But these were like our first kind of like something similar to a padre, right? They watch, it's secular, but it's all under the guise of like assimilation or civilizationist kind of ideologies about what is making Indian people backward, so they criminalize a lot of that. For the Hupa, though, to negotiate that they want an Indian agent nearby, it indicates that they thought that an Indian agent would uphold the boundaries of the reservation, meaning they would keep settlers out. So it's always like that deal with the devil kind of thing, right? Like, is this security or is this surveillance? And right. I think you accept, they were savvy. I think they understand what an Indian agent is, and it's just they're rolling the dice here. But that figure of the Indian agent in the Hupa reservation and other reservations becomes really important and a carceral figurehead. There's just a good story about the Hupa police when they get them a decade later, that the cops won't listen to the Indian agent, and one of them gets drunk and actually shoots him. And so the Indian agent's a vexed figure.
Okay. Yeah. We didn't even get to that part in the paper. So interesting. Really want to learn more about this history, but we'll stick with what you were able to present in the context of this, short piece. So the U.S. Indian agent in this case, R.L. Stockton, you kind of went over his role, and he came into conflict with somebody that you name in the paper Curly-Headed Tom, hoping you can kind of introduce Curly-Headed Tom and his crew.
Yeah, he's my favorite. I don't know if we're supposed to pick favorite archival figures, but he's absolutely my favorite. And the names are just incredible, aren't they? It's like... who's a leader, and then Sewan Alden John is a very important captain at the village of Sewan Alden, and Indian Frank and Handsome Billy, and you got to just be hoping to be handsome.
You have to root for Handsome Billy for sure.
You're beholden to him, and they're really charming figures, and it's actually Indian Frank who shoots the Indian agent a couple years later. So this group has run into him a bit. As you can imagine, right? They're kind of infamous among settlers. They know these names. They're named in the papers. They don't mince words. And so they want the end of the United States. They're very clear that for them, there's no negotiation. So the treaty is signed, and this group, among others, are really dissatisfied with the terms for peace. They don't believe the United States. They've seen too much already of what they do. They don't believe that they have any intention of honoring the terms of these treaties. And so they just decide to kind of become outlaws in the way we might think of it. And they're outlaws among the Hupa as well, because the Hupa who signed the treaty are like, you're in violation, you're going to cause problems. So they're a little bit outliers on both, although they're getting help also from people who say that they're peaceful. So there's a bit of subterfuge and lying and doublespeak happening that enables these men to continue resisting the US. They attack mail pack trains because everything's on a mule, like hiking through, so they attack and rob provisions, supplies. They kill mail carriers who at the time are like federal officers kind of. So somewhere between a letter carrier and an FBI agent. So they're taking these people out because they see what they're doing. They see they're mapping their homelands. And really Sam Alden John and Curly Headed Tom, they're all out on the outsides in Redwood Creek and Grouse Creek Indian homelands. In the valley would be Hupa, but up in the mountains is where these ancestors are from. And there was just no one better at navigating those really dense forests and really like basically billy goat trails that you will slide down today if you walked on. Like you really have to know your homeland, and their knowledge and intimacy with those more than human beings, the rivers, the celestial beings, the stars, that those are really what enabled this militant resistance against the US. I have in that paper, there's that piece from a newspaper. It's like some 50 years later, and it's a settler recalling the stories of Curly Headed Tom, because there was no one more vicious, right? There was no one more hellbent on chasing settlers out of here. He had a very clear political vision that an end to the violence against his people meant an end to the United States.
And if striking the fear, all this fear, and the settlers was what it took, he accomplished that. And like you said, had the home advantage of like knowing the land. In the paper, you also talk about this dichotomy of the bad Indian versus the good Indian and how Curly Headed Tom fits into that dichotomy. Could you speak more to that narrative and Curly Headed Tom's place within it?
The term bad Indian is a famous one. It's in the archive. It's kind of like that term, the Indian problem. And it always kind of means the same thing, right? We have the US as this colonial invader. They have an Indian problem, which is that Indian people have all the legitimate sovereignty and claim to these territories, these homelands, and that they are in the business of dispossession, but they have to make it look legitimate. So how do we solve this Indian problem? And, of course, it's first these genocidal wars or acts, horrific acts of violence. That loses credibility. You can't build a legitimate state with that horror, right? You have to have something to legitimize yourself. And so treaties, and then the project of saving the Indian, saving the soul of the Indian. So conversion, right? Missionization, these things become really important. And then later, like boarding schools or other kinds of training. If these people could be trained to read and write, then they could be citizens, that kind of thing. Solving the Indian problem is kind of how we get this dichotomy of good or bad Indians. So good Indians are the ones that at least act at obeisance to the United States. They're willing, they're trainable. They're often have examples of the first people to do schooling or go to law school, right? These are good Indians. These are ones who can be brought into the lower rungs of a white supremacist hierarchical state. These people can be our lowest examples of civilization for us. So it's also like play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right? Like if you want to be a good Indian, you're just saying like, oh, I'll give legitimacy to this white structure and be at the bottom of it. And so a lot of Indian people are very savvy to that. I see that's not a prize I want to win. And so what could we gain from being a bad Indian? Like what can we gain from refusing, let's say, to give up languages? Or in Hupa, the Indian agent, Stockton, he has so many letters where he's like, these Indians will not stop. These Hupa people will not stop dancing, will not stop singing, will not stop fishing in the morning, right? These sorts of things that make them Hupa people. So they're bad Indians. I really pick up that phrase. Deborah Miranda, of course, wrote a very important foundational work in California Indian Studies, a tribal memoir called Bad Indians, where she also traces her family genealogy to show that resistance to the US and refusing to stop being a people is what has earned us that misnomer or that title. So now it's a proudly worn thing, bad Indians. And I read this with curly-headed Tom, who refused these carrots from the United States, right? Refused the promise of protection or safety, and really decided, he declared this, that I really love his declarative statement, that he would never come into the reservation or cease fighting the whites or their Indian allies, that he won't. He said, no, like, I see what they're doing, and I'm not playing. I'm not a good Indian. And he decided that to stand out as a leader, against the U.S., which is why he's criminalized and then arrested.
I mean, it is like the way that there was such a concerted effort to disappear histories like this. It's like amazing to hear about ones that actually like are still in circulation. Thank you for like spotlighting this one in particular. Maybe you could fill us in, like, how does Curly-Head Tom's story end, and then where are we now in sort of like the story of Hupa resistance?
Yeah, Curly-Headed Tom's story is really how I first found him, because I was looking for cases of murder or death while in prison during this time. So I was looking specifically at Fort Humboldt, at Fort Gaston, and then eventually to the Arcata or Union Jail, the town Arcata up in Humboldt. It used to be called Union anyway. These settlers, they only have like 3 or 4 names for places. It's like Washington, it's Portland, or but anyhow, so I was looking for ancestors in these jails, because if you know from the Bay Area, a lot of people who are arrested, Indian people who are arrested in California, get sent to San Quentin in this early and formative years of the United States in California. So I was interested, as I always am, in local jails, because our people still today, California Indian people, are held in local jails more than prisons. And if you want to find the real numbers of incarceration and police proximity with Native people in this country, it's jailing. That's the highest frequency for shorter periods of time. Anyhow, so I was taking that kind of contemporary knowledge and looking for ancestors. And that's how I found what happened to Curly-Headed Tom, that he was arrested because it was 1867. So it'd been a few years since the Treaty of Peace and Friendship was signed. And so his acts of resistance, attacking pack trains, like I said, or killing settlers that trespassed or, had the misfortune of crossing his path at the wrong time. Those actions were depoliticized in a sense, and they were no longer like Indian resistance or like the Indian Wars, because those were over, the United States said. And so what's now happening is that those were individualized criminal acts. So he was a murderer. That's no longer Hupa resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That should feel familiar to a lot of us who study history of revolutionary figures, right? That they're a criminal, right?
Yeah.
Revolution.
Yeah.
That is what happened, that him and his kind of whole gang, at its height, it was like 50 resistors that remained after the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And they're kind of sequestered and kind of placated or brought into the fold in these bigger tribes, or the like more peaceful tribe, right? The ones who have signed the treaty. And in the case of Curly-Headed Tom, who was so forcefully against coming in, he said, he'll never come in. I'm not done, and he meant it. And they knew he meant it, the US, the Indian agents, and the other marshals, as well as like US, like volunteer militia are big at this time. It's a way settlers make money, is by hunting Indians. And so he's arrested. He's brought into Fort Humboldt. It's a carceral site in Eureka, California. You can still visit, with settlers fly kites there, which seems fitting for them. Later, he's transferred to the Arcata jail. He spends several nights in jail, and he's executed there. He's shot in the back of the head while he's laying down. Of course, it's a very tragic end. And it's just where it is and how he's arrested and how he's executed. It's such an indictment of what the United States is and how they continue to treat resistance, California Indian resistance, to their occupation on our homelands and elsewhere. I just think, like the Curly-Headed Tom story, it's impossible for me not to draw those parallels between the murder of Tortuguita and To Stop Cop City, which of course happens in this Muskogee forest on their homelands that they're defending. So like it's different geopolitical context, and like they're not indigenous people necessarily, all the people resisting, But it's a striking historical parallel, I think, when you resist the food systems, the life ways that make life sustainable and like a pleasure to live. When you defend those things from the United States, that you're met with the complete carceral force of this empire. So it's just hard not to see for me a historical parallel with what is happening now. It was settler colonial dispossession then, right? Where they're trying to like gobble up raw materials to breathe lifeblood into this fledgling empire. And then now, almost 200 years later, that the same kind of carceral force and the criminalization of individuals defending life, that it's the same kind of arm of force that's met. So it looks very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Wondering what you're working on right now.
Right now, well, I'm finishing my postdoc. And so this is my time to hurry up and research and write, because as I'm told, you don't get this time for very long. So what's exciting to me right now about writing is I'm finishing another section of this history that was like a little baby, it's when your dissertation, it's your little baby ideas that aren't all the way cooked. And now I'm spending the time. So I'm actually looking at period slightly later in the 1880s. And I'm looking at Chinese expulsion in Humboldt County and Chinese migrant workers and people who become California Indian families. They marry into our communities. And I'm looking at those kind of unanticipated intimacies between migrant or arrivant others and California Indians. And how those familial bonds or other forms of kinship undermine the property logics of the United States and our resistance. And so I look at expulsion in that moment.
Super, super interesting. Stoked. I can't wait to read more of your work. If people do want to follow your work, is there a place online that they can check out?
Yeah, floating around online. But I have a website. It's just my name, stephanielumsden.com. And I post my new things, my new pieces of writing or new media things. So this podcast will be on there as well.
Tight. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Again, can't wait to check out your upcoming work and hopefully see you at the next American Studies Conference.
Yeah, exciting. Yeah, sweet. Thank you again so much, Toshio, for having me and talking with me. So much fun.
All right. See you soon.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/Sad Francisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.